Hello everybody and welcome to this video. .NET 6 is out, ASP.NET Core is shipped, and there's been quite a few changes that have left a lot of people confused, like who moved my cheese, where's Startup.cs? This video I hope will take a dive into that and see where it went. Things haven't fundamentally changed in the middleware for ASP.NET Core, but some of the project structure has changed, and where you put things has changed a little bit. So let's deep dive into that and figure out what's going on. So let's get started. All right, so the first thing I want to do is create a new project, a console project. We'll call it old to new. And I'm going to have it be a .NET Core 3.1, and we're going to upgrade it to a 6.0 and see what the differences are. If you've been around .NET for a while, you'll recognize this old project structure. We're going to go ahead and change this over to a .NET 6 project piece by piece and explain what has happened. So some of the changes they made in .NET 6 was to simplify and remove cruft from our application. One of the first features they introduced was something called file scope namespaces. I mean, if you've been around .NET for a while, seriously, how often do we put more than one namespace in a file? Like never. So you can remove these curly braces, put a semicolon here, and have file scope namespaces. Now it's going to complain at me because this is a 3.1 project, so before we go too far, maybe we ought to edit our project file and change this from a .NET Core 3 app to a .NET 6.0 app. Okay? If we do that, what changes is this namespace now is happy. And the other thing that we can get rid of is a using statement if we add implicit usings. So let's go back to the edit project file and add implicit usings, type enable. If we enable implicit using statements, most of the common using statements that exist will be included in the SDK by default, and you no longer need to include them in your file for everything to work. The next feature they added was something called top-level programs. They wanted to remove the cruft that was basically unnecessary, but present in every console application or ASP.NET Core application for that matter. So they just said, hey, we can get rid of this, and we don't really need this namespace anymore. And so what we're left with is just the stuff inside, and this actually still works. So if we run this, you'll see hello world. Okay, very cool. Currently, this is just a plain console application, but I want to turn it into currently this is just a console application, but I want to turn it into an ASP.NET Core application. But before we do that, let's take a look under this dependencies and frameworks. Currently, you see Microsoft.NET Core.app. That is the SDK that includes all the required packages to create a console application. So watch what happens when I go back to the CS proj file and I change the SDK to a .web project. Notice what happened over here. The framework brought in Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.app as the framework. Besides the framework bringing in all the necessary packages for an ASP.NET Core app, the other thing that changed was the global using statements. Now, let's get rid of this console. And let's type this. We're now just constructing a web application. Where does this web application come from? It comes from Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.builder.web application. Let's type var app equals builder.build. Whoops. If I can type. Typing's hard. And then we can do an app.run. Now if we do this, it'll be kind of boring because there are no endpoints. So under the minimal API model, which is what this supports out of the box, now we have a fully functional minimal API web application in ASP.NET Core. It wants us to reload the projects. Should have done that before. But let's run this. as an old to new. Now when we launch the default path, it returns hello world. So we have a fully functioning web application. Minimal APIs are a great way to quickly build a web API project. The middleware flow is similar to that of the full web API and MVC projects and shares much of the same implementations. In previous ASP.NET Core projects, you were given a Startup.cs class with two methods in it, configure services and configure. In configure services, you would register services for dependency injection. In configure, you outlined your middleware pipeline order and structure. But what does this look like in our new project? Where do you put dependency injection? The answer is between this first builder statement and this app.builder.build. So for instance, if I wanted to add authentication, I would simply do that. But in order to use it in my middleware pipeline, before I start my map get, I would have to say app.use authentication and app.use authorization. So in a nutshell, everything on this first line where we construct the builder and before we do builder.build is where our dependency injection registration is accomplished. Everything after builder.build is the middleware pipeline from here all the way down to the bottom. Okay, the code here is not quite complete for actually adding authentication. While we're here, let's go ahead and do it the way that it needs to be. We also need to add Services Dot Add Authorization. And in order for this to take effect, you need to annotate the endpoint that you want protected with the authorize attribute, which needs the using statement of Microsoft ASP.NET Core.Authorization. It still isn't quite complete, but let's run it to this point and see what happens. Okay, we've got an unhandled exception. We expect this because we'd never specified an authentication scheme. Let's go fix that now. Now, there are a lot of different types of authentication schemes we could choose, but in a web API, it's typical that we protect the application with something like a bearer token or a JOT token. So let's go ahead and add JWT bearer to this. So we're going to go up to the add authentication, and for now we're going to just say add JWT bearer. We'll have to resolve that. And it doesn't know what that is. That's because we need to bring in a NuGet package for that. So let's do that. There it is. ASP.NET Core Authentication JWT bearer. Let's install that. Okay, so add JWT bearer has been added and it recognizes it. Should we run it to this point and see what happens? Still no authentication scheme was specified and there was no default challenge scheme found. All right, let's go see if we can fix that. Well, even though we've cascaded this and chained that on, we really need to tell the authentication system what our default is. JWT bearer defaults dot authentication scheme, and it doesn't know what it is, so let's see if we can resolve that. There we go. And if we hover over this authentication scheme, we'll see that it's just a constant for string with the word bearer in it. Okay, so with all of that in place, now let's see what happens. Still not happy with us. No authentication scheme was specified. All right, this actually happens quite a bit to me and probably to others out there. I went through and I put default authentication scheme, and that's sort of the wrong thing. We really want default scheme. Default scheme is for all the schemes specified. And if you remember from some of my other videos, if you haven't watched them, go watch them. There's two separate schemes that we need to configure most of the times, an authentication scheme and a challenge scheme. Or if I just say default scheme, that means that we want JWT bearer defaults to be the authentication scheme and the challenge scheme as well. This should change things. Let's try it and see what happens. Okay, and this is exactly what we're looking for, a 401 unauthorized, because we haven't supplied it with any kind of token. I think this is good enough to demonstrate where to register dependent services and where pipeline middleware gets configured. We haven't really set up all the necessary parameters to get JWT bearer authentication working completely, but that is out of the scope of what I'm trying to demonstrate today. Instead, what I want to look at next is how do we bring back something like a Startup.cs file? As you can see with these minimal API structures, it can get kind of busy trying to put everything all in one file, putting all your dependency registration, your pipeline, middleware configuration, and all of your endpoints. So there must be a way that we can construct this a little bit in a little bit more organized fashion. So let's try to do that now. One quick thing before we jump into the Startup.cs. Earlier I put this authorize attribute here, and while that does work, and it is kind of an interesting looking pattern, there's another way to make this endpoint protected. So let's go ahead and put that on, and I'll show you what that looks like. There's a fluent way, and it looks like this, .require authorization. I think this looks a little more natural in the newer minimal API structure, so I'd highly recommend using the extension method approach as opposed to the attribute approach. Now let's move on and add a Startup.cs file. In the interest of time, remember we don't need this namespace anymore, so let's just paste this in. Okay, so this is actually the same startup structure from the older style templates. In the constructor, it passes an iConfiguration, and there's a configure services and a configure section. And notice that the configure services takes an iService collection, and configure takes an iApplication builder and an iWeb host environment. Let's see if we can just make that work. So let's go here and let's just say startup equals new startup. Now remember, it requires a configuration. So will this work? Well, lo and behold, off the builder object is a configuration object that seems to be happy passing in as an iConfiguration to startup. So far so good. Now what if we do startup.configure services, and remember it requires an iServices collection. So let's see if builder.services can be passed in and if it would be happy with that. Looks like it would be happy with that, and if that's the case, then I should be able to take all of this code out, and we'll switch it around a little bit, put it in here, and instead we'll say services, and also here services. So okay, that looks like it should work. Now everything after here is the pipeline, right? So if I say startup.configure, which is where the pipeline goes, it wants an app. Well, it looks like I have an app, and then an environment. Let's see if we can get an environment. Well, we certainly can. Now, in theory, I should be able to take all of this, in fact, all of this down to here, and put it in startup. It didn't like that part. How come it didn't like app? iApplication Builder does not contain a definition for map get. Okay, so something's not quite the same. Let's go back and take a look and see what's different. Well, in here, app is a web application, but configure is expecting an iApplication Builder. What if we just change this around a little bit and said, well, we're going to pass you a web application. Would you be happy with that? Looks like it's happy with that. All right, it's time to run this and see what it does and see if it works. Well, we got our 401, so that's a good sign, isn't it? Looks like it's still working and serving. So we haven't done too much different. The only thing we did was we put a lot of our configuration stuff in the older style startup.configure services and startup.configure. All right, so this seems to work and it's pretty cool. It allows me to plug in something that I'm comfortable with, which is the old Startup.cs file. And it does clean this up a little bit, I guess, but I think we can do better. I've always hated in the startup file that the words configure services and configure are so close to each other, plus you're passing in a configuration, that it kind of gets confusing about what goes where. Why don't we take the opportunity to make this better? And I'm going to try and figure that out right now. So let's see if we can figure it out. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm making this part up as we go along. This is fun. For one thing, I don't like configure services. What if we called it register service dependencies or register dependent services? I'm going to call it that. And instead of shoving both the service registration and the middleware configuration in the same file, what if we created two new files to register those things instead? This may be a stupid idea, but let's just try it. Let's go ahead and add a new class, and I think I'm going to call this register dependent services.cs. Naming, it's the hardest thing to do. And then we'll add another one. We can always rename these later if we don't like this, but let's call this one, how about setup middleware pipeline? I'm going to go back here. Let's make this static. And I'm going to make a method public. What the heck should it be? I want to take in, let's see, let's go to here. I'd really like to chain it off the end of create builder, right? So create builder returns a builder. So let's say that we take something that returns a builder. Wait, what is that builder? It's a web application builder. It's right. It takes a web will return a web application builder, but it takes a builder. So, and I'm just going to call this register services method, and it's going to take a this web application builder, and we'll just call it builder. Okay. Does that make sense? Then at the end of it, we'll just say return builder. Let's put some code in here to see what that would look like. Let's add this. Put it inside of here. The difference is we need it to, since services doesn't exist, we'll just say builder.services. And we'll say builder.services. Oops. Naming and typing, two very hard things. So in here, let's just put a note to ourselves. Register your dependencies. So that's where we'll register them. So let's actually wire this up so far. I'm gonna change this a little bit. We'll start up here. Let's comment all this out for now. I don't know what I'm doing. This is fun. I'm just gonna call this var. I'm gonna show you, in my mind, I kind of have this idea that I want it to look something like this. Create builder, pass in args, and then I want to do register services. And add use old to new, register services, and I'm going to put in here, no, that's it, just register services. Should be all I need, right? And then we'll call build. So let's wrap this around so it looks a little bit better here. And when we do build, we'll get app. Okay. And then we can say app dot setup middleware pipeline. And then we'll say app dot run. I mean, that could work. Let's go see what that would look like. So let's make this static. I left the namespace. And then we'll make a public static. This thing will return a web application, I guess. And we'll call it setup middleware. Don't need to pass in anything other than this web application app. Makes sense. Now let's go into Startup.cs and let's pull all of this out. I want this stuff to go in here. Configure the pipeline. Then we'll just say return app. And then when we get over here, really all we want to do is say run. I don't know, something like that. Is that better? That should still work. Should we try it and see if it works? Maybe I broke everything. Yeah, still works. So it's happy with that. I don't hate that. What do you guys think? So if we look back at Startup, we've successfully taken the configure services and the configure methods, rename them to something which I think is a little bit more representative of what it does, register dependent services and set up middleware pipeline. The only thing we haven't accounted for in Startup is this constructor that accepted a configuration object that was oftentimes passed in and used down below. What can we do about that? The whole point of bringing this in was to have the configuration object available when you're setting up your services, or sometimes even when you're setting up your middleware. Well, how do we get access to that? Well, remember, Builder has the configuration available. So we have that already, and obviously that's not happy because I'm not doing anything with it. But there's configuration, and app also has access to the configuration values. So there's really no point in passing in iConfiguration, since both app, web application, and web application builder have access to the configuration objects at this point in time during setup. So I think we're good. So there you go. There's some different ways to to do this. I kind of like that because you can put all your register services in place and your setup middleware in a place and still see the general flow of creating a web application, setting up the middleware, building it, and running it. Well, we did it. We found our cheese, and I think we might even have better options now. I hope this video helps you, and if you found it helpful, let me know in the comments below. Pass it along and share it with someone else too. Thanks for watching.